All right, welcome back everyone to ECE 590. Today we have two presentations. The first by Tamer Rousan. Tamer Rousan is a first-year part-time PhD student advised by Professor Peter Sauer. His research interests are distributed energy resources, distribution planning, and energy policy. Tamer earned both his BS and MS in electrical engineering from UIUC. He has spent 12 years in the utility industry, all with Ameren, Illinois, where he last served as the manager of DER integration and strategies. He is currently the director of distribution and grid modernization at EPE Consulting.
All right, thanks, Max. Let me know when you can see my screen.
Not seeing it yet. Oh, there we go.
Okay, great. All right. Well, again, thank you. This is my first time presenting on the seminars, so appreciate the opportunity. Today, I wanted to talk about really some interesting work that's happening across the country in general, but here also in the state of Illinois, and that will be the focus of today's talk around distributed generation valuation in different jurisdictions called DER valuation. And what I want to discuss here is the framework, something that we've worked on at Ameren for about a year now in terms of putting together the framework and a methodology for how to value distributed generation. It's an open docket currently, so a lot of the stuff that I will share today should be available on the Illinois Commerce Commission website, and you can see the direct testimony that I filed as well as other co-workers from Ameren have filed. So again, there'll be a lot of reference there for the work that we'll show here today. If you have any questions, we can probably answer them towards the end. I don't know, Max, if that's your plan or if you plan to field questions during the presentation, but either way should work for me.
Okay, well, we'll leave it up to you then.
Okay. All right. Yeah, if we want to hold them till the end, that would be good. We can answer them all as a bunch. Okay, so the agenda for today or for the talk is really the following. I was going to go through background and motivation of the work, talk specifically about the Illinois context of DG evaluation, go over some value stacks, then talk about the distribution system benefits that we see from DG, talk about the framework itself, go through some sample calculations, and talk about next steps. So starting with background and motivation of this work, like I mentioned, specifically here in Illinois and also across the country, there's work already trying to figure out the best way to evaluate the benefits of DER. DER, in all its technologies, whether it's energy storage or solar or demand response, is rapidly increasing across the power system. And multiple states and jurisdictions right now are trying to investigate what are really the costs and benefits of DER and DG that they provide to the grid. There are mechanisms and programs and policies really that vary across, like I said, the different jurisdictions, and context is extremely important as you try to evaluate the cost benefit analysis or try to figure out exactly what each state tried to do. For example, some states might be focused on, say, carbon emission reduction through their valuation framework. Some might be really interested in replacing net metering as a tariff that exists today. Some might be trying to just barely encourage renewable energy and renewable energy adoption. You'll see a lot of rebates to try to encourage that and support that. Some are looking at market participation. So it really varies around, or a combination of all the above that I mentioned. So the programs and the policies and the mechanisms really vary from state to state, depending again on what each state is trying to do and the goals they're trying to accomplish. This is not necessarily a comprehensive list of states that have currently or are in the process of developing DER valuation methodologies. California have specific distribution valuation methodology that's ongoing right now. New York as well has been working on their valuation mechanism for a couple of years. Minnesota has what they call value of solar. It's been already updated this year. Oregon, Indiana, and of course the city of Austin, they all also have programs and policies right now. They're trying to investigate similarly what the value of DER is. In our state here in Illinois, we have a specific piece of legislation that was passed in 2016 that really required utilities in the state of Illinois, along with stakeholders, to investigate the value of DG and really put together an annual process or a formula to calculate the benefits of DG in the form of rebates. There's a lot of verbiage here. You can read it at your ease later on, but in general, that's really what the context of this text is trying to show. I tried to put in bold specifically what the law have asked for, which were the value of these rebates shall reflect the value of the distributed generation to the distribution system. So it's very specific about what it's trying to evaluate the value of distributed generation to. Like I said, there are multiple value streams that can be looked at, but the law was specific to try to address the value that DG can provide to the distribution system. And then it added multiple parameters around it, which is at the location at which it's interconnected, and also taking into account geographic, time-based, and performance-based benefits. So really this guided the work here that we're trying to show today around the framework of the DG valuation. As I mentioned before, anytime you're trying to figure out what cost-benefit analysis you have at hand, you're going to try to look at the different value stacks that you can get from your asset. In specific here, we're talking about DG, of course, and DER. So a quick survey of the different value components, whether it's from literature review or just really trying to understand what DG can do, was really the first step. As I mentioned before, states include different elements of calculations based on their specific goals. But here is, again, some of the high-level potential valuation building blocks that are common among the different states and among the work that's been done in different jurisdictions. There are things like avoided environmental cost and try to monetize that, avoided distribution capacity cost, which you will see highlighted in the work here, avoided transmission capacity cost. Again, for the context of Illinois, the focus was on the distribution system, so this is not something that was looked at here. Avoided reserve capacity cost, generation capacity cost, avoided plant O&M and fuel cost. And then also there's that large category of non-energy benefits. They're more revolving around public and societal benefits that folks are trying to derive monetary value off of. So in the context of the work in the state of Illinois, again, the focus was on distribution system benefits. And here what we looked at and tried to understand is how does DG provide value to the distribution system. And really we concluded that the value revolves around four main building blocks. It's the capacity value deferral, the voltage support value, sub-transmission contingency capacity, and then loss reduction. Throughout the distribution system, these are the main grid benefits that we see DG really impacting. So the work later on will be specifically trying to build a formulation and a methodology to capture that. The framework really revolved also around some key philosophies. This is kind of from a utility perspective. It was put together through. So the first philosophy is it has to be consistent with currently established and state-approved utility distribution system planning processes. If you're familiar with how utilities do work today and how they spend dollars to invest in the grid, they do it based on specific set of planning processes that are approved, like I said, by state and local jurisdictions. I'll give an example. The utility would go through what we call a load forecasting and a load analysis process. You take a look at a feeder, for example, you look at the substation, you forecast over the next 5 years what its loading is going to be, and then you compare that to the capacity of the transformer. And if you're under normal operating limits in 5 years, then you're good. You don't really need to do anything with that asset. However, if you're above the normal operating limits and you might overload that transformer, then you would look at putting a project to upgrade that transformer. So this is an example of how utilities invest based on a specific planning process, and that drives really how utilities today operate. So staying consistent with that, and given the fact that this has been approved already by the local jurisdiction, was a key philosophy here. The second one is trying to abide by the law, which is making sure that the framework meets the geographic time and performance parameters that were put in it. And what this means is really we have to look at DGs at the specific locations going to be interconnected to the distribution system. So we're not going to look at a wide grid-based benefit, but we're going to look at specific locational benefit. And this is the nuance that a lot of jurisdictions don't have out there, and a lot of states don't have out there. A lot of them are grid-based, large kind of overview of what grid benefits a DG could provide. The work that we're doing here is specific to the location where DER or DG is going to be interconnected. Typically, those are happening at the distribution transformer or the secondary distribution transformer. So if you're a residential customer on the roof of your house, or if you're commercial, on top of a garage or an empty parking lot, these are all being connected at the secondary distribution transformer, and we're evaluating this framework at that specific location. So you can imagine now we're talking about thousands and thousands of nodes where we'll have to run analysis for and be able to provide a specific dollar value per kW and kVAR at that specific location. Talking about time as a parameter here, as we all know, DG output and asset loading vary with time. So different loading profiles change, again, based on the type of load that you got, and they do vary with time. Similarly, the DG output varies with time. There are specific, for example, for solar, specific set of irradiance that to that specific location where it's at, and also a specific number of hours that it's expecting to operate at. Typically, the ability of a DG asset to reduce a loading on an upstream asset is really when its operating profile or generating profile is overlapping with the load profile of the asset. So if you have a transformer that, like what we said, is being overloaded, if you have a solar asset with its profile, output profile, overlapping with that loading profile, that's when you see benefits and potential to reduce the loading. A key concept here when we're talking about penetration of DG and its value to the grid, as penetration of the same type of DG increases, there's the concept of diminishing return, where you see that there's decreasing benefit to the distribution system, where the output profile of that specific DG type no longer overlaps with the asset that you're trying to evaluate. And that's where the concept, like I said, of diminishing return comes in, and that's an important one to keep in mind. When we talk about performance as a parameter here, really the methodology that we put together estimates performance based on an expected output that was based on heuristics and historical data that we got here in the state of Illinois. So we collected data on wind assets, solar assets, and looked at their overall performance, which is not necessarily what's typically promised on an NREL website or from a vendor that sells you the product. So that was taken into consideration when we were looking at the performance of the asset. The last key philosophy here that we wanted to incorporate is for folks to understand that this framework is based on the incidental value that the DG provides to the system. Meaning, if I am a residential customer and I put solar up on top, there's no control for the utility over my asset. It's just going to operate however I've set it up. West facing, south facing. If I have a battery and I have a specific mode of operations for it, for example, the utility has no control over it. So it's the incidental value of how I operate the asset and how it ends up providing value to the grid is what's captured in this specific framework. So overall, how did we actually operationalize this and execute it? So we took our distribution models for more than 2,600 feeders that we've got in the Ameren, Illinois territory. And we start with the smallest node available to us. And then we basically perform analysis with and without DG. So you run your analysis as a normal case. If there's DG existing before your analysis, then you leave it in there. You use your typical forecast that you have for that specific feeder that's based on, again, historical data, as well as the data about load growth that you might have that you'd put in there. And you forecast that for 5 years. You run the analysis without DG, and then you run the analysis with DG with incremental increase of DG of that specific DG type that you're trying to preemptively calculate until you get like what we said, the diminishing returns stopping criteria, stopping point, and then you start calculating what that monetary value is based on a comparison to the typical upgrade. We'll go through an example of that. So we captured the range of kVA and voltage change for different capacity and voltage violations, again, based on that planning criteria. And then we assign value to the kVA based on traditional investment cost. This is what, on a high level, a distribution feeder might look like. On the left-hand side, that's where the feeder head starts at the substation level. And then going downstream to the right, you will see the different components that are evaluated in the planning process. These are things like the conductor itself, secondary distributions, transformers, reclosers, or regulators that are out on the line. And again, based on the framework that we just described, we're going to check the hourly baseline and forecasted loading, compare those with the planning criteria. These are the emergency and normal operating limits for each asset. We're also going to compare here voltage profiles against what, again, the planning criteria is, and assign value to DG that's downstream of that accordingly. If you look at that bubble, that yellow bubble, and let's say there's a violation at this device here. I'm showing I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's this square here. Anything downstream, any DG installed downstream of that square, if that square was seeing a violation, is going to help or potentially help improve the violation. So you will see value for DG for anything downstream of it. Anything upstream of it, however, is not going to contribute to value to that specific asset. So you'll probably see 0 value for any DG installed upstream of the violation. In here, we have a quick matrix that I put together that really walks through what we call the rebate value multiplier. And it's a way to capture that value that a DG could provide a specific asset. Back to the planning criteria, we said anything under normal operating limit is really okay. It's not a violation of the planning criteria, so the utility is not going to initiate any projects for. So there's really no value for DG that is operating or that is located downstream of an asset that is not seeing any violations or any problems. When utilities see problems and they start initiating projects and want to put an upgrade, is anytime you're over the normal operating limit and you're reaching the emergency limit. That's when utilities start funding projects, and that's where DG can really provide value in terms of, can you defer that funding or help reduce that funding overall. So the font here might be a little bit small, but case 1 is looking at an asset where before DG and after DG, you're still under the normal operating limit. So there's really no value there. There's no overload, and you won't see any value for a DG that's downstream of this asset. If you take case 2, where you have an asset that is above the normal rating when you don't have DG, and then after you added DG, actually helped and brought that loading down under the normal, then yeah, you do have value here, and you eliminated an overload. And the value multiplier is really the delta between the before and after normal rating divided by that difference or delta between the emergency and normal rating itself. Here's another case where before the DG, the asset was above the emergency rating, and then the DG was able to bring that asset all the way down below the normal rating. And here you're eliminating the emergency, and you get a value for the full upgrade that the utility would have paid in this scenario. And I walked through a couple more cases, but you get the idea. The value multiplier typically tries to see if you can really eliminate the problem and bring that overall asset and defer the overall upgrade or spend that the utility has planned for that specific location. I think sample calculations kind of help drive home all the ideas that we're talking about, and I focused on the capacity value mainly, but I'll talk here also about the voltage and subtransmission examples where there's value for DG at these specific planning criteria scenarios. So here's an example where it's a substation transformer fed by a subtransmission line. So this is the higher voltage. Typically in Illinois, this is a 34 kV line or a 69 kV line, and then goes through transformation and then turns into a distribution level circuit, typically 12 kV or 4 kV. And that's where you see most of the distributed generation really installed at. And a lot of the incentives in the state of Illinois is to keep the DG below 2 megawatts capacity. So that's where a majority of them are installed on the distribution side of the system. So for an example, again, if we take this scenario where we had a constraint at the substation transformer, and we have a DG installed downstream of that transformer, the capacity constraint substation transformer has a normal rating of 10 MVA and an emergency rating of 12.4 MVA. If I wanted to upgrade this specific transformer based on, again, what Ameren has paid in the past or has invested in the past, the upgrade cost would have been around $800,000. So what we do in this scenario is we look at a 5-year, again, horizon for the load forecast. That's, again, our planning criteria established here. And a lot of utilities use the same methodology. This is consistent across utilities in the United States. So if you look at the 2025 peak load, projected peak load, it's 10.3 MVA. So that's definitely above the normal rating. So if there's PV or if there's DG installed downstream of here, it's going to provide value to this asset by hopefully reducing its loading. So again, the 2025 projected loading, no solar, is 10.3 MVA. We install a 2 megawatt AC solar array downstream, say at that location, and again, rerun the model with that 2 megawatts modeled, then your future projected load is 9.2. So you went from operating or loading above the normal rating, and then you brought it down under the normal rating. So if you remember our multiplier from that matrix, you will see value here for the DG, and this is how we're going to calculate the monetary dollar value to it. So the multiplier or the proration calculation is really the delta of the normal rating to the loading, the forecasted loading, divided again by that ratio of emergency to normal. So you have a multiplier of 0.125. If we take that and multiply it by the upgrade cost that the utility would have spent at that location, you will get $103,000 is the value at that specific location for a 2 megawatt solar. So really, if you break that down into per kW basis, you're looking at $51 and change per kW at that specific location. So that's an example of, again, a planning criteria that we looked at for a specific substation transformer and where a DG downstream could provide value. And again, we're running before and after analysis, so before no solar or no DG, and then after with DG, and trying to see if the loading is actually reduced, and that's how we're assigning value to that specific location. So similar analysis would have to apply to distribution transformer, and you would be able to assign value preemptively across your distribution system. Similar to the capacity value, this is a quick example for voltage value. So here, same thing. If you look at the cost to install a single phase voltage regulator, costs about $20,000. 2 megawatt AC solar installed in the area of the low voltage violation here. We would model the circuit with 120 volt base, and you look at what the voltage is before and after installing or adding the DG. So in the planning criteria, just like we have normal and emergency operation limits for the distribution transformer, here we have normal or minimum allowable voltage at the meters of 113, and then risk of model low voltage begins at really 117. So the minimum is 113 per law. 117 is where we see risk. So anything above 117, we don't initiate any projects. Anything below 117 or at 117, we start initiating projects. So we run the model for this circuit. 115 volts is what we found the voltage to be in that specific area where without solar. If you add that 2 megawatt solar at that location of the voltage violation, you've improved to 117.2. So you already eliminated that voltage violation. Then we go back to the same concept of prorating the value. And you see here a multiplier of 0.5. So your available dollar value at that location is $12,500. And then if you break that down per kW, it's really about $6 per kW. So far here, for this scenario, if you had both violations, a voltage violation and distribution capacity violation, you just really add up the value for DG that's installed here. So it's the 51 from before plus the $6 if you go install DG in this location. I'm running out of time. I think it's 3:27, so I'm going to speed through this. This is a little bit more complex. It's the subtransmission piece. So on the higher level here, we consider some contingency scenarios where if you lose one line, there's a higher risk of you creating an outage, or there's higher risk of you really overloading that other line when you try to serve multiple loads. So we take into account these probabilities. And then we still continue to use the same proration factor. So we have a prorating factor of the change in probability of creating a violation on that subtransmission line. And the value here is a little bit higher because typically the upgrade cost on the subtransmission side is of course higher. It's a $5 million project if you want to upgrade one of these lines. So really the value for this DG here, if it can help with that contingency, is about $81 for subtransmission. So again, if you sum all these three up, you're looking at a value of $139 per kW if you install DG here. So everything we said is trying to formulate a mathematical model that allows you to calculate this, like I said, using heuristic data and historical data that's available at the utility, and take advantage of that planning criteria that exists and is consistent across the different jurisdictions in the country. And the idea here is be able to calculate these values for each or for different types of DG and produce those values out on, say, on a heat map or on some kind of a system-wide view where customers can come in, log in and say, oh, okay, I see the value there, for example, at 139. The customer does their own financial analysis and decide, yeah, that helps me and I'm going to be able to break even or make money on that investment and go ahead and install there. Versus on a different circuit where there's no value, so it helps you really as a developer and as somebody that's trying to add more DG to the system to plan ahead and accordingly. So I kind of went through some of the next steps here in the last minute, generalizing the mathematical formulation and allowed to adopt also different planning criteria. Expand this to not only focus on distribution, but see how we can encompass transmission, capacity, energy capacity, and other type of value streams, and then automate the calculation to calculate DG value for hundreds or thousands of nodes across an entire distribution system. And that's it for me. Any questions?
Last call for questions. All right, I guess there's no questions. Well, thank you, Tamer.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
All right. And up next, we have Prerak Chapagain. Prerak Chapagain is an ECE second-year master's student advised by Professor Sauer. He completed his undergraduate degree in electrical engineering with a minor in actuarial mathematics from the University of New Orleans. His research interests revolve around renewables and grid modernization.
All right, thanks, Max. And hello, everyone. Can everyone see me and my screen?
Yep, we can see it.
Also, the pointer. Can you see the pointer moving up?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Perfect. I hope everyone is doing well during this pandemics. Today, I'll be talking about the research I've been working on with folks at ITI and CSL. We're working on the IEEE 1547 project. And basically today I'll be talking specifically about the stability analysis on the impact of the increased DR penetration. The DR, Tamer talked a lot about DR, but basically a DR is distributed energy resource. It could be a form of solar or it could be a wind, and it could also be a combination of a generating source and a load. I mean, the way you distinguish a microgrid versus DR is microgrid could be self-sustaining, but DR could not be self-sustaining. It may not be self-sustaining. So that'll be the key difference between microgrids and DR. But yeah, before getting into my research, I think it's important to see the motivation behind the IEEE 1547 standard and how it came in the first place. So as you can see, there's a rise of renewable energy. So, but most of the renewable energies, they come in the form of distributed energy resources as DR. And when you have multiple DR getting connected to the grid, you have to make sure that the interconnection standards and the interconnection regulations and all that has to be in place, and it has to be in order to maintain the voltage and frequency stability and to maintain the grid reliability. It is pretty obvious that you need some sort of interconnection requirements. So that's why, I mean, at first it was California Rule 21, which is very similar to IEEE 1547 standards, which basically talks about the interconnection of DR to the grid and what will be the proper way. So at first in 2003, as you can imagine, there were distributed generation, distributed energy resources, DR, were increasing, but not as much. So it was maybe, I don't know the exact number, but it was like maybe 1% or 2%, very less, very tiny amount. So in that case, I mean, still needed a standard, but what they did was they came up with a standard which says, in case of any disturbances on voltage or frequency side, the DR would just trip. So it was shall trip in response to abnormal voltage and frequency condition. And it shall not actively regulate voltage or frequency, which kind of makes sense because if you think about it, there's not much DR. So even if you just trip off some DRs, it'll be actually good because DRs won't get damaged and the inverters or stuff, it won't get burned. So everything is fine. And even if it goes off, it won't affect the grid in a much way because since the DR penetration is so little, it doesn't really matter even if you trip them off, right? But then as the years went by, DR gets increased, and then you need a revision in the standards. So in 2014, IEEE 1547, they came up and they said they went from shall to may. So you may write through abnormal voltage and frequencies. So you might have to write through and maybe sustain, and you may actively regulate voltage by changing real and reactive power, and you may change real power in response to frequency deviations. But then the increase of penetration increased so much that in 2015, 14, 2018, it was just a requirement. So you have to write through, you have to be capable of actively regulating the voltage by changing real and reactive power. So it was just a must or a shall requirement where you went from shall not to may to shall. And the reason being the increased DR penetration. So I hope that this gives us enough motivation to see why IEEE 1547 is relevant, because you have to follow the standards to be able to connect to the grid, and you have to stick to the standard. But the problem with that one is, if you see the last point, it shall also have communication interface. So when you have the communication interface, it's also going to be prone to cyber attacks because any mode changes or any sort of regulator APS commands is going to be passing through the communication interface. And so that becomes an attack surface for the adversary to make some changes or do some malicious setting changes. And we'll be talking more about later on. But before I talk about the use cases and attack, just an overview on different kinds of modes so that we can understand the standard better in terms of reactive power and active power modes. So with the reactive power modes, there are four options. The four options are, the first option is constant power factor mode, which is basic constant power factor as the name says. The second one is voltage reactive power mode, which is same as in volt-var curve. And then the active power, reactive power mode, which is basically based on your active power, you give certain kind of reactive power value. And the fourth one is the constant reactive power, which is just a basic constant value reactive injection or absorption. And then for the active power control mode, there's only one mode, which is just voltage active power, which is basically going to give your watt value based on your voltage level. Also, notice that there is two different categories. You have category A and B. But we assume it to be just category B for our case, because as you can see, they're all mandatory. And so that way we can play our use cases better, and we can look at all the scenarios and all the use cases, and we can sort of exploit this mode functionalities to come up with use cases. So just a high-level view of what the different modes are. And what we look at, our use case is exploiting this idea about different mode changes, and to be able to say that the area EPS, the operator can choose which mode to operate on. And that flexibility to choose that mode brings the attack surface on how an attacker can change these mode settings in a harmful way. So this one would be the use case. If you look at the column on the left side, so that would be, this is basically an operating condition. So everything's fine. And then the right column is basically an attack scenario, or what happens after the attack. So let's see at first. Okay, so this one is active power mode. So you have volt watt curve, which means let's say you're working at V, voltage is, let's say, 1 pu, nominal voltage, or so it's going to be right here, which is going to be 0.9 pu. So maybe 0.9 pu of injection of power. So you are injecting 0.9 pu while you're operating at nominal voltage. So that would be the normal scenario. And in the normal scenario for the reactive mode, let's say you have 0.9 power factor. So that's if you have your apparent power as 1 pu. So you just are saying that you're injecting 0.9 pu of active power, and then you're injecting 0.44 pu of your reactive power. That's 0.9 power factor. And that just comes from S squared equals to P squared plus S squared equals to P squared plus Q squared. So yeah, so this is just normal operating mode. So what happens now is the attacker is going to change the mode from constant power factor mode to watt power curve, to watt power mode. And what it does is, well, for the volt watt, it's going to stay the same because there's only one option for volt watt, and the attacker just leaves it as it is. So as you can see, the V1, so let's say it is at 1 pu, or even if it depresses, so even if it goes below 1 pu, it is going to stay around this area. So it is going to be injecting 0.9 pu. But then the thing with the watt var curve is because it's going to say, okay, I'm going to follow the watt value, and the watt value is 0.9. And if you see this watt var curve, it goes to negative 0.44, which means it is going to absorb 0.44 pu of reactive power. So you see the problem here. You go from injecting 0.44 reactive power to, you go from injecting 0.44 reactive power to absorbing 0.44 reactive power, pu of reactive power. So you're just going from generation to absorption because of this mode change, because of this malicious mode change. So obviously that's a problem, and it is going to change the voltage and frequency stability and the trajectory of the system, and it's going to change the dynamics, and it's pretty obvious that we can see that, right? Also, one thing to note that this curve settings can also be changed, and that gives rise to different use cases. So you could just change one of these watt power curves or anything, and that's also depending on your operator can change these settings. But for now, I'm using all those default standards, the default values that's in the standard, to just make it just simplified and just focus on this use case, because this use case just talks about the mode change, not the curve settings change. So it's just mode change, and it's just simple that way. So that's the attack, right? And then, okay, so let's look at our system. Our system consists of area EPS, and then that's connected to two DRs. Two DRs are equivalent DRs, and that's connected to APS, which is just more or less a three-phase source. As you can see, it's a constant load. Basically, two DRs connected to the APS, and you have a bunch of loads. So that's our system. A simple system we carried out in Simulink. So also one thing to note is this change. I mean, it's kind of obvious that the size of the DR. So in our model, the DR was 400 kVA, and this DR was also 400 kVA. It's going to vary on the APS ratio. So basically, the ratio of DR to the APS is going to vary on how bad the attack is going to be. So if you're, and it's kind of obvious, right? Because if the DR is very small, and it's very small in the ratio of the APS, you're doing a mode change, it won't affect that much. But if your DR is a huge proportion of APS, a mode change or some sort of tweaking in these curve settings is going to impact. So to do the experiment setup, I think the first idea is to realize that the ratio of DRs to APS is going to be vital in determining the state of the system's trajectory on the voltage and frequency side. So what we decided to do is you have two DRs shown as represented as a collection of DRs divided in half. So you do the first attack at 2 seconds on the half of the DRs where the mode change, the attack happens, the use case that I was talking earlier about. So you do the mode change on the first half, and then on the second half, you do it after at 5 seconds. And then that one also does a mode change. The reason why we divide it into two DRs is to kind of simulate a common mode change attack, because let's say you have like 5 DRs and all DR go through a common mode change attack and how that could be harmful to the system. So that was the idea behind having 2 DRs. But yeah, and then you do that for 100 different ratios, and you did we did a Monte Carlo simulation to just come up with 100 different ratios, and then you just simulate that one in the simulink to see how the trajectory of voltage and frequency changes in terms of varying DRs to APS ratio. Okay, so these are the results. If you look at the first graph, so this line, the left graph shows the DR1 reactive power, and the second, basically the blue line, which is overlapping with the orange line. So blue line is DR1 reactive power, and the orange line is DR2 reactive power. So as you can see, at first, before the attack, they were both injecting reactive power. So the 0.44 PU of reactive power corresponds to 200 kVAR when you have a 400 kVA system. So you're injecting 200 kVAR at first before the attack. And at 2 seconds, what happens is you can see the first DR getting attacked. So you go from 200 to negative 200, around 200. So, and then at 5 seconds, you see even the second DR also goes to negative 200. So let's see how it is going to affect the system. Just ignore the transients for now. But yeah, so if you see this voltage trajectory for different Monte Carlo simulations, it's pretty obvious that the first one, and the first 2 lines are where the DR ratio is very small. So that could be like 1% or 2% and all that. And maybe this portion is maybe like 30%, 40%, and this portion could be like 50%. So it can be just inspected just by looking at it. So we can see the situation gets worse and worse if the DR to APS ratio is higher, and that was our speculation in the first place, and that seems pretty obvious. Also, a few things to note is all these transients you see is because of the collapse, because as your DR to APS ratio increases, and because of this attack, the voltage and frequency just collapses. If your DR ratio is very high compared to the APS. If it's small, like 1% or 2%, then it's going to sustain. Even after both attacks, it's just going to sustain and nothing's going to happen. But if it just goes down, it's just going to be a problem. I've eliminated most of the oscillations because it just makes the figure messy. So I just left some of the oscillations, but then for the remaining one where it just collapses, I've denoted it as a single line, right? You can see at 2 seconds, and then at 5 seconds, just there are a bunch of points. Like this one probably corresponds to 90%, 95%, 80% DR ratios, but just as a solid line to represent voltage collapse. And you can see the similar transition on the frequency, and just collapses at 2 seconds and 5 seconds for this high ratio DRs to APS ratio. So the findings are we want to see which ratios and which size is detrimental to what kind of attack. Oh, one thing to note, which I forgot to mention, is remember we have this write through settings now. So depending on your category of DR, it may write through for some time. So it might write through for 21 seconds. For, let's say we're considering a category 3 DR. I don't want to get into details of the standard because it just gets confusing, but let's say you have a DR category 3. It says that if your voltage level falls down to 0.88 PU, between 0.5 to 0.88 PU, then it has to write through for 21 seconds. So in that case, it is going to write through for 21 seconds, and then it's going to trip. So that's why it's important to consider tripping right off versus right through separately. And we can see this one on this last figure. I think if you just look at the last figure, it summarizes everything because you have first attack and second attack going through. So if your DR size is less than 14%, you're fine. So even if you do a more change, like we said, went from 44% 0.44 pu injects into negative 0.44 pu, it doesn't really matter if your DR size is less than 40%. But if your DR size is between 14 to 35%, what it's going to do is going to write through, and then it's going to trip off. And then after 35%, it's just going to just collapse it, and it's just going to trip off immediately. And the reason why I'm trying to draw a distinction between these two, between this yellow and red region, is because at red region, except for the mitigation and except for the cybersecurity, strong firewall settings and all that, there's no way you can do from the system level side to mitigate it, because it just goes trips off, right? So except for detection, there's not much you can do. But for this between 14 to 35% in that 21 seconds time frame, maybe there's a way you can do from the system level to mitigate the issue. So that will be something which could be a potential future work, because at first we realized that the increasing penetration of DR calls for stronger cybersecurity protocols. So you obviously have to do that. But then possible mitigation also lies in the system level. You can utilize uncompromised DR through machine learning or something. For example, let's say you have 10 DRs and then 5 DRs get compromised. So the remaining 5 DRs can be, the curve settings for those different mode changes can be devised in such a way using some machine learning tools to come up with an optimal way you can mitigate the scenario by pulling back the voltage and frequency trajectory in a way that it is going to stabilize the system. So that could be something you can do from the system level if you are in this operating region. But after that, beyond 35% penetration, users have to make sure that you have a proper cybersecurity standards and all that. So yeah, and then also a future work could be implement other use cases, because so far I've only talked about one use case where you just do more chains. But then there could be multiple use cases, and we have actually come up with multiple use cases. It just could be a curve setting. You change the curve setting, and that could be a use case. So to see which use case brings the worst results and which use case are more relevant would be something we can work on, we can look at more, and that'll be a topic for future work. But yeah, that's it from my side. I think I went too fast. I just had to bullet through. But if you have any questions, I'm open towards it. No questions?
I guess there's no questions. So, well, thank you again, Prerak. I guess that wraps it up for us today. Thank you again to Prerak and Tamer for presenting for us today. Yeah, everybody have a good day.